All right, Shevuos, say good morning. Good morning. Shevuos, Baruch Hashem, to be back with all of you. A special thank you to Rabbi Richter for giving such a beautiful and masterful shir over the last couple of days. Today's daf. Well, first of all, I'll begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tavshin Pei, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the shir and drushos this year as a zechus for Besaros Tovos Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar Haba Alina Latova, Shmuel and Rabin Karapkin, the creation of the yard site of Shmuel's father, Mr. Leonard Karapkin, Lipa Ben Yecheskel HaKoyin Zichron Lebrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol L'Chol Yisrael. Kodesh Baruch Hu Shemir Tashem, return our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karov, and our holy soldiers should be successful. B'chol Maaseh Yedehem. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Yud Aleph. We have a really incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Aleph. We're picking up actually on Yud Amud Beis. We're going to go back a little bit because the sugya that began on Yud Amud Beis really extends all the way through the entire daf. So let's make sure to get clarity on that. We're going to take this slow and methodically, and you are going to remember how beautiful, how incredible, how fun, how exciting, and how inspiring Shevuos truly is. All a question of perspective, mindset, and what you hope to get out of it. So let's begin. So we're picking up 10b Yonah Beis Amr Ula Amr Rabbi Yochanan, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. Amr Ula Amr Rabbi Yochanan. All right, look, if you feel you've mastered it already, you don't have to go back. It's fine. I'm hearing some groans. Okay, good. If you got it, you got it. Good. I need to review it. So the Gemara says as follows. So Ula said name Rabbi Yochanan. Tamidin shlo hutzuchol etzibor niftin tamim. So both said this is a very interesting case. So the halacha is as follows. Now, let's take a look at Rashi. Like I said, we're going to go through this slowly and methodically so that we're able to hold cup on this, because this concept of Ula, or say Rabbi Yochanan, is going to be the one that is going to be subject of discussion today and tomorrow, all of today and part of tomorrow. So take a look at Rashi. Rashi is on the left-hand side, about 4 lines into the short lines. So Tmidin Shalahutzer Cholitzibor. Shalachko Mimos Trumos Alishka. So we'll say, so we know how this is, right? Every year on the 1st of Nisan, remember back in our Masechah Shkalim days, in the 1st of Nisan, they would make an announcement. What was the announcement for? Machzis HaShekel. Well, really, again, already in Adar they would do it. But 1st of Nisan, again, they would begin with the new collection. So the way it worked in the Beis HaMikdash is essentially the financial year began on the 1st of Nisan. So what would happen? So now you have Shalakhu Mimaus Truma Halishka Utinan in Poschin Mishisha Tlam Hamuvakar Lishka Satlaim. Okay, so here's what happened. So they would obviously they would purchase communal sacrifices from the Machzis HaShekel, from the half shekel fund. Now there was a law. The law was you always had 6 sheep. I was going to say in the bullpen, but it's the sheep pen, right? They had, remember, one of the chambers in the Azar, in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, was called Lishkas HaTeloim, right? If you're looking at that aerial view of the Beis HaMikdash and you're looking down, you'll see the Azar, the courtyard. The courtyard had a major center area and 4 side chambers. One of those side chambers was what's called Lishkas HaTeloim. In the Lishkas HaTeloim, Rashi points out over here, they always had 6 sheep ready for communal sacrifice. Okay, that's the background. Now what happened? K'shemagir Rosh Chodesh Nisan lo hayu makrivin shuv karbanos sibra mimaos hatruma shalish takid ki dikar mesachas Rosh Hashanah Chodesh bechadsho va'avei karban mitruma chadasha. Okay, so now what happened? Come Nisan, essentially the beginning of the financial year in the Beis HaMikdash, so they would only bring communal sacrifices from new monies which were collected. Okay, now what that often presented was, or potentially presented, I don't know often, potentially presented with an issue. What was the issue? So what happened? Comes Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now generally there were leftover sheep in the Lishkas HaTeloim, in the chamber of sheep. The issue was you can't offer them. Why can't you offer them? Why not? Because they were purchased with last year's Machzis HaShekel. Because of that, they could not be used for this year's sacrifice. So now the question is, you have 4 sacrificial sheep sitting in those Lishkas HaTeloim. What do you do with them? What do you do with them? So Rabbi Yochanan introduces something I will say rivetingly groundbreaking. What does he say? Niftin timimin, no problem, just redeem them. Just redeem them. Now, now we're going to say this is a shocking statement. Why is it shocking? Because in general, in order to redeem something from a sacrificial sanctity, what do you usually need first? A mum. You usually need some type of blemish. You need something. In other words, you need the animal to be disqualified from its sacrificial capacity in order to be able to redeem it. In this case, Rabbi Yochanan is saying something shocking. I will say it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking that you could just redeem this animal straight out. Look at Rashi for just a moment again. Rashi is going to be very important. Rashi is always very important, but very important for us in this sugi right now. Niftin timimin lachshirin b'shanazu mechal. So Rashi identifies a little bit more about what the process is. So what do we do now? What's the goal of redemption? Both say the goal of redemption is to make them fit for use, for sacrificial use in this current year. So how do you do this? Look at Rashi. Lachshir mishanazu mechalin olsan amos chulin v'osam hamos yelchu lemos ra'truma yishana she'osem mehen rekue pachim sipoy lebris lebeis kodesh hakadashim. So first thing you do is like this. And now remember, I have these four animals, 4 sheep. So first thing I do is I redeem them. Now what happens when you redeem something? What happens when you redeem something? The sanctity transfers to the money. So now I have money vested with the sacrificial sanctity. What do I do with the money? I put it into the residual of last year's machzis hashaka. Okay, because remember again, the sanctity of those animals is directly connected to last year's machzis hashaka. So I redeem the animals, put that money into last year's residual machzis hashaka. What's done, by the way, with whatever is remaining from last year's machzis hashaka? What's done with that? Generally, we'll call it in a general sense, temple upkeep. Temple upkeep, right? Specifically, it was repairs for the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So now I'm taking the animals, redeem the sanctity unto money, right? Money goes into the pot of last year's machzis hashakel. Any of that leftover money ultimately, again, is used for what we'll call Kodesh HaKadoshim repairs. Okay, good. So far, so good. Now, what about now the sheep? What's the status of the sheep? What's the status of the sheep? Chulin. Total chulin. So now what do you do with the sheep? Watch this. He goes on, he says, V'cheva sheyetzu l'chulin chozrin v'lochim osam mimaos truma chadasha v'akriv v'shanazu. Great, what do you do with it? You now take new half shekels from this year's collection and essentially repurchase the sheep for the Beis HaMikdash use. So again, let's just go through the process, right? What's my problem? That's not a general statement. I'm talking about over here, right? In other words, what's my problem over here? My problem is I have leftover sheep that are vested with sanctity from last year's machzis hashakel, which I can no longer use past this current Nisan. What do I do with it? Redeem them. Take money, transfer the sanctity of the animals onto the money. The money then is put into last year's machzis hashakel pot. That is used for Kodesh Kadoshim repairs. The sheep are now chulin. Now what I do is I repurchase those sheep with this year's machzis hashakel, and we're good to go. We're good to go. And I will say, amazingly enough, remember the sheep have never left the Lishkas Hatlan, right? Remember again, all of this is done without them. V'yafagav she'ein behemas. Now Rashi points out over here, here's the real chivish. V'yafagav she'ein behemas kadshe yochid mischaleles below mum kidikaim lon mive'im ko behema. Timeya damar mar bevali mum shiftu akaz medaber elu shel tzibor niftim. Shabbos say, what's the tremendous chivish over, as we just said? We never heard of redemption like this. Because generally, redemption of a sacrificial animal, at least in the realm of personal sacrificial animals, must always be preceded by the appearance or emergence of a mum, something which disqualifies the animal. This is a unique halacha by karbanos tzibor, by communal offerings. Beautiful. We'll say, so that's it. That's it. So that is a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, groundbreaking chiddush. Good. To which the Gemara says, fine. Back to the Gemara. Yosef Rabbi v'ka'amar laha shmaita. So Rabbi is coming along and Rabbi is saying this over. So what happened? Amar lei Rav Chisda man sayis l'chol Rabbi Yochanan Rabcha. So Rav Chisda says to Rabbi, where did you and Rabbi Yochanan, your Rebbe, get this from? In other words, mechanistically, how exactly does this occur? There seems to be a major problem. What's the major problem? V'chi kedusha shebahen lehecha halcha. Where did the kedusha go? In other words, you just described the process, but I don't understand why that process works. In other words, Rabbi says, we're going to see in just a moment, generally, take a look at Rashi. Kedusha Shebahen, Rashi's right across. Kedushas Haguf, Shebahen, the Kimlan She'ena Mischaleles Below Mum, Heichan Halcha. So we'll say we know that in the world of sanctity, that there are different types of Kedushos. There's Kedushas Haguf, right, which is physical sanctity. There's Kedushas Damim, which is monetary sanctity. The way it works in general sacrificial law, right, so a carbon generally has Kedushas Haguf. The only way to go ahead and redeem something that had Kedushas Haguf is how? Essentially, if the sacrifice loses its sacrificial capability. Hence, the mum. In other words, so I have a carbon that has physical sanctity, Kedushas Haguf. Now it has a mum. That mum precludes it from being offered up. That's my opening for redemption. But in general, you can't take away physical sanctity with financial redemption. It doesn't work that way. So Rabbi is very proud of this statement of Rabbi Yochanan that here you could just redeem these leftover sheep, but Rav Chisda is saying, wait up, how does that work? That's not how redemption of physical sanctity works. I'll just understand. Kedushas Haguf is the highest form of Kedusha. Right? Because remember, what does Kedushas Haguf mean? What does it mean? It means that the Kedusha itself is part and parcel of the item, as opposed to, let's say, financial sanctity. So financial sanctity essentially means that there's an element of sanctity embedded in this object, but there's also other elements. Kedushas Haguf means that at the end of the day, the entire essence of this item is Kaddish. So Rav Chisda says, where did the Kedusha go? It's very nice that you went ahead and you put forward this fantastic model of redemption, but practically, where did the Kedusha go? That's what a mum is supposed to say. Now you understand. What's so beautiful and riveting about this Gemara is that for the first time we actually understand like how these processes work. Oh, now I get it. I have a carbon. Carbon has physical sanctity. That physical sanctity is the highest level of sanctity. The only way to quote unquote I don't want to use the word get rid of, but redeem the animal from that sanctity is how? Is if something interferes with that sanctity. What's that thing that interferes with sanctity? A mum, right? So a mum says, sorry, we can't offer you up anymore. Okay, so now that mum opens the door for redemption. Rabbi Yochanan is essentially espousing a model that allows for redemption of something that has Kedushas Haguf without the mum, without the entranceway. To which Rav Chisda says, what? Wait, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? So we'll say it's incredible. So let's go weiter. So the Gemara says as follows: Kedusha b'hem leheichan hacha. Amrlei, atlo tizbara. The law minon kedusha shebahen leheichan hacha. So to which Rabbi responds to Rav Chisda, do you not agree with this concept that we're discussing? Vatnan. Listen to this. In other words, Rav Chisda, you're making it sound like something that has kedushas haguf can't be redeemed without a mum. But I'll show you that you hold of this as well. Take a look at the most incredible Gemara. I just point out, by the way, on a tremendous Musar Haskell level. Understand what the Gemara is saying over here. The highest level of kedusha is kedushas haguf, an inherent kedusha. They will say, what does a yid, what does a Jew possess? Kedushas haguf. From the moment I come into this world, if a person is born Jewish, or if a person converts, in the moment that they convert, right, their entire essence is vested with Kedusha. It's a Kedushas Haguf. The Kedusha of a Jew is not something, I will say, like sometimes we think about these things, and we think about kind of our Judaism or Yiddishkeit as something that is, a chelik of us. Like, I'm an accountant, and I'm Jewish, right, and I like baseball, and it's like a function of like, but that's not the way that it is. Like what I do for a living is something very nice. Or hopefully we all enjoy what we do for a living. It's not who I am, or at least it should not be who I am. Right? It's a function of what I do. It's a function of what I do. Yiddishkeit is who I am. That's kedushas haguf. It's who I am. And fascinatingly enough, what creates a little bit of the breach in Kedushas Haguf? What creates the breach? A mum. For a yid, what's the mum? Is chet. Chet. The scariest part of chet is that chet has the ability to breach a little bit of that Kedushas Haguf. But the beautiful part of it is the reality is that it doesn't. Chet, nothing could breach Kedushas Haguf. The Kedushas Haguf of a Yid is impenetrable. It's unchangeable. Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisraelhu. We think that Chet breaches Kedushas Haguf, but Kamash Malan it doesn't. By a carbon, Mum breaches Kedushas Haguf. By Yid, a Mum, Chet, and Avera changes me, but never breaches my Kedushas Haguf. Incredible. All right, it's any event. So Rabbi shoots back at Rav Chisda. Chisda, what about the following? Vatanan. Most is fascinating. Most HaKetoras, Mahayu Osimba, same case, just not leftover karbanos, leftover ketoras. We'll say there were always leftovers in the Beis HaMikdash. Again, Rashi goes through over here. Rashi, he says, Moser HaKetoras, Hanoser Bechol Shana Mitshuma Yeshana. Same thing. Remember, the spices for the ketoras were purchased with what? Machzis HaShekel. Comes the 1st of Nisan, you have to use ketoras purchased with new money. So now, you had leftover. Now Rashi explains why they had leftover ketoras every year. Not important for us. I mean, it's very important for us right now, but right now we're going to stay a little bit more focused, right? So what do you do now? It's now the 1st of Nisan. I've leftover ketoras that was bought with last year's Machzis HaShekel. What do I do with it? See, here we go. So the Gemara says, very simple. This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, Mafrishin mimena schar ha'omnin, u'mechalalin osa al ma'os ha'omnin. So watch this. So look at Rashi. Mafrishin schar omnin, mitrumas halishka, schar umne beis avatinas, mefat me'aktores, ar meseches yuma, she'enot l'mechal shana shnei maseh. So first thing they would do is, you have to pay workers. Right? So they would go ahead and they would pay the workers. They would pay the workers from last year's Machzis HaShekel. So it was, which sounds interesting. It sounds like, remember again, what's it from what Gemara was that? Was that Yuma? Also it shows up in Tainus about Beis Avatinas, right? They were the ones who knew how to make the Ketores. Remember again, specifically, what did they know that no one else knew? Mali Ashan, which supposedly we saw in Yarchei Kala, but I'm a little bit suspect about that. I think the guy might have been smoking some Mali Ashan before we. Anyway, so the Maisa, right? So what's fascinating about this is apparently Avatinas got paid at the end of the year. They got paid at the end of the year. So comes the end of the year, they got paid from last year's Machzis HaShekel. Okay, so follow the progression of this, right? What's our problem? Well, it's always important in life to identify what problem we're trying to solve. What's our problem? Leftover ketoras, right? Leftover ketoras. Remember, can I use it in the new year? No, why not? It's from last year's Machzis HaShekel. So what do I do with it? So again, step one, pay the workers. So we pay Beis Avatinas from last year's Machzis HaShekel. Okay. Now watch this, Rosa. So now, after they receive that money, look at next Rashi. Mechalin osas schar maos to'omnin. Mezakin amos lo'omnin ay de akar min ha'gizbarin v'harein chulin. V'achar kach yischalu ha'ktoras alehen v'nosin osan lo'omnin v'arehi chol v'cholzun lo'kin osam m'jumeh chadash. This is great. So watch this. We pay the workers. After we pay the workers, we say to the workers, do me a favor, we'd like you to purchase the leftover or redeem the leftover ketoras. So now, Beis Avatinas takes their wages, which is last year's Machzis HaShekel, and redeems the leftover ketoras onto the money. The money, then what happens to the money? Right? Money goes back into the temple pot, last year's Machzis HaShekel pot. What's last year's Machzis HaShekel used for? What is it used for? Repairs of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And now Beis Avatinas have what? What do they have? Ketoras. They have now the redeemed Ketoras from last year. Now what does the Beis HaMikdash do? The Beis HaMikdash then goes and repurchases the Ketoras from Beis Avatinas. But they repurchase it with what? They repurchase it with the funds of this year. Sounds like a shtickle Ponzi scheme over here, right? But Lamaisa, here's the chap. Remember, just understand what we're trying to do. It's not a scheme. It's very clear. We're very transparent about what we're trying to do. We're trying to go ahead. We have a problem because we have leftover or sanctified items from last year's Machzis HaShekel, which we can't use this year. So we need to create a mechanism to essentially allow them to be used because they were bought with this year's Machzis HaShekel. So that's all we're doing over here. So again, process. Pay Beis Avatinas, right? Pay the Kohanim, or whatever, pay Beis Avatinas for their work. Pay them with the money of last year's Machzis HaShekel. Then they take that money, redeem the leftover ketoras. Okay, now that money goes into last year's Paramachzis HaShekel. Beis Avatinas have this ketoras, which by the way is now chulin ketoras. Beis Hamikdash goes back and repurchases it from them with this year's machzis shekel, and we're good to go. Good. And I will say, this is the process outlined that everyone agrees happens for Ketores. The Gemara says, again, va'amai. So Rabbi says back to Rav Chisda, va'amai. Neima kiddushin shabahem lehecha halcha. But how can you do that? What happened? Remember, Ketores also is kiddush. At least we assume is kiddusha saguf. Ketores is also physical sanctity. So if Ketores is physical sanctity, I will say again, the assumption the Gemara is working under over here is that when something possesses Kedusha Saguf, physical sanctity, you need something to interrupt the physical sanctity so as to allow for the redemption. So again, by an animal, it's a mum. By Ketores, I don't know what it would be. But in Pepashas, I would need something. So how can you just take something that has Kedusha Saguf and suddenly redeem it with money? So Amrale, so Rav Chisda says, Rabbi, calm down. Ketores kabrit, you're talking about Ketores? No, the Gemara says, shiny Ketores, top of Yud Aleph, today's daf, shiny Ketores, the Kedushas Damimhu. Oh, Ketores is different. Ketores, says Rav Chisda, this is fascinating, is not Kedushas Aguf. Ketores is Kedushas Damim. Ketores is monetary sanctity, not physical sanctity. Fascinating. Look at Rashi. Kedushas Damim, ein ba'ela Kedushas Damim, shelakcha mitrumas halishka. Aval bekli lo kidsha de tikdash kedusha saguf de machtecha shenech shaba lav kli sharisu. Fascinating. Now, I will say, in order for something to have kedusha saguf, so again, for an animal, the way an animal gets kedusha saguf is that it gets carbonic designation. Carbonic designation, harezu ola, harezu shlamim, harezu chatos. So verbal designation by inanimate objects, the way they become kadosh is through placement in a kli sharis, in a service utensil. If you're not placed in a service utensil, by definition, you have kiddushas damim, monetary sanctity, but not physical sanctity. This is fascinating. Ketores, and now, is Ketores placed in a kli sharis at a certain point? Yes, because remember again, how is Ketores offered? Remember again, about say Ketores is offered. Ketores was put on a magrifa, like a shovel pan, right? So that was a klisharis. But when you're talking about the production of Ketores, right, or for that matter, again, the storage of Ketores, so Ketores was ground up. You take the spices or the herbs, you grind them up. That's not that mortar, that pestle. That's not a klisharis. Those are Beis Hamikdash utensils, but it's not a klisharis. So because of that, interestingly enough, Ketores, up until the point that it's actively used in the Beis Hamikdash, has never been inside of a klisharis. Because it's never been inside of a service utensil, it only has financial sanctity and not physical sanctity. This is mind-blowing. This is absolutely mind-blowing, because again, up until you saw Shevuos Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, we always assumed, of course, Ketores has physical sanctity, and again, because it's being used in the service of, sometimes if I tell you something, just agree with it, right? Just shake your head, right? Yes, that's what I always thought, right? So again, we always thought that because Ketores is physically used in the Beis Hamikdash, that of course it has physical sanctity. But the Gemara is saying, or Rabbi is saying, or Chisda is saying, no, it doesn't. It's never been inside of a klisharis until it's actively used in the Beis Hamikdash. And its point of preparation, it only has financial sanctity. Financial sanctity, I will say, financial sanctity is a lower level sanctity. Financial sanctity, the same way that it is financial sanctity, therefore what? It could be redeemed financially as well. That's why leftover Ketores could simply be redeemed. Now again, can you do this with any Ketores over the course of the year? No. This is a din in how you redeem leftover Ketores, but the idea is that the sanctity could just be actively removed because it's not physical sanctity, it's only financial sanctity. Okay, so what's that? So just keep track of the progression over here, right? Where all roads lead back right now to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, what do you do with leftover sheep in the Lishkas HaTziloim? You redeem them. How do you redeem them? You go ahead and you transfer their sanctity onto money, put that money into the last year's pot of machzas shekel, and then repurchase them with new machzas shekel. This is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi, his student, agreed with it. Rav Chisda said, what about the Kedusha? How can you do that? How do you just take away physical sanctity like that? Rabbi says to Rav Chisda, you don't agree with this? What about Ketores? Ketores, we pretty much do the same exact thing. To which Rav Chisda responds, no. two different animals, or two different things, right? Ketores is not physical sanctity. It's not Kedushas Haguf. Rather, what is it? Kedushas Damim. Kedushas Damim, monetary sanctity. So now, Rabbi shoots back. If that's the case, that Ketores is only financial sanctity, monetary sanctity, and not physical sanctity, Alamatai, Elamiata, Lo Tivsol B'Tvul Yom. It wouldn't be a Monday without a Tvul Yom. We'll say, so listen to this. So now, what about Tvul Yom? Right now, who's the Tvul Yom? I mean, don't raise your hand, but I'm saying right. I will say, sorry. Who's the Tvul Yom? A Tvul Yom, I will say, remember again, is someone who is tamei, right? Has gone to the mikvah, but requires hair of shemesh, right? Requires sunset. Now, he's an interesting guy because in certain respects, there are certain elements, right? In certain respects, he's tahar. He's gone to the mikvah already. Perhaps again, waited the duration, but he still needs that sunset. So the Gemara says like this: if you're right about Ketoras, and Ketoras only has financial sanctity and doesn't have Kedushas Haguf, then if that's the case, then if a Tvul Yom touches it, he shouldn't make it Tameh. Yet we know that he does. Alama Tanya, why did we learn? Nasna, listen to this. Nasna Machtashas. If you put the herbs of the Ketores, right, and you begin to you put it in the grinder. Machtashas is a grinder, or mortar and a pestle. Nifselis b'Tvul Yom. If a Tvul Yom touches it, he makes it puzzle. He makes a puzzle, which I will say would seem to indicate that Ketores is not Kedushas Damim, rather what is it? Kedushas Haguf. To which the Gemara says, V'chi Tema, Kol Kedushas Damim Mifsli B'Tvul Yom. Well, I don't know, maybe even items that have Kedushas Damim, maybe they also become Tameh with contact with the Tvul Yom. In other words, I don't know, maybe that's the Gemara is just saying, maybe that's the halacha, that even Kedushas Damim becomes Tameh with contact with the Tvul Yom. To which the Gemara says, V'Atanan, we learned, Hamenachos Mo'alin Bahem Mishahuk Deshu. Right, the menachos, which is a carbon mincha, so they become subject to me'ilah. Remember again, me'ilah means mundane use of a consecrated object. So they become subject to me'ilah, mishahuk deshu, from the time that they were consecrated. Kadshu b'kli, once it was consecrated in a kli, hochsharu lipasal b'tvul yom. Ultimately, once it became kadosh in a kli sharis, then it becomes fit or it becomes susceptible to tumah through a tvul yom, or mechusar kippurim, or for someone who hasn't yet brought, someone who's telling you hasn't brought his necessary karbanos, ubelina, and through being left over overnight. So what do you see from here? Kadshu b'kli in, lo kadshu b'kli lo. So I'll say, what do you see from here? That even items that possess financial sanctity only become subject to Tumah through a Tvul Yom once they've come in contact with a Kli Sharis, right? If it hasn't come in contact with a Kli Sharis, then it should not be subject to Tumah through a Tvul Yom. So remember, what's our problem? Our problem is that we just said before that if a Tvul Yom touches Ketores, the Ketores ultimately becomes Tameh, which would seem to indicate to us then that what? That Ketores is not simply Kedushas Damim, rather it must be something else. Elamai, Kedushas Hagufi. Rather, what we have to say is that Ketores ultimately has Kedushas Haguf. That Ketores is not simple financial sanctity, but rather Ketores actually possesses actual physical sanctity. That I will say, now understand the interesting part about that. Now, what we're suggesting is that Ketores has physical sanctity, even though what? Even though it's never been in a kli sharis, it's never been in a service utensil. So it must be that the act of putting the Ketores into the machtashas, right, the act of putting the Ketores into the grinder, or right into the mortar and pestle, by definition vests it with Kedushas Haguf. Ela me'atel tipasa belina. But if that's the case, I will say, so there's like a lot of moving pieces over here. If indeed, Ketores has Kedushas Haguf, then ultimately it should become puzzle with Lina. What's Lina? Lina ultimately means being left overnight. So now it should be puzzle through being left overnight. So when it says, Alama Tnan, why did we learn Hakometz, Vahalavona, Vakitores? So let's remember again, Kometz is the 3 fingerfuls that the kohen takes from the Karban Mincha. Lavona is the frankincense that is put over a personal carbon. Ketores is Ketores. Minchas Kohanim is the Mincha of Kohanim. Minchas Kohen Mashuach, that is the special Mincha of the anointed Kohen. Minchas Nisachim, Mo'alin Bahen Mishahuk Deshu. So they are all subject to Me'ilah once they've been consecrated. Kidshu B'kli, once they have been consecrated in a service utensil, Kli Sharis, Hochsharu Lipasa B'Tvul Yom, Ub'mechusar Kippurim, Ubelina. Once they have come in contact with a Kli Sharis, so then again I will say, then what? Then they are susceptible to Tumah through a Tvul Yom. Mechusar Kippurim is someone that didn't bring his requisite Karbanos, and Lina. So we'll say, but again, so remember, follow the flow over here. What do you see from here? That a karban or a sanctified item is only subject to the prohibition of lina, which means leaving overnight, when only once it's come in contact with a kli sharis. Problem we keep running into is that ketores has never come in contact with a kli sharis. Has never come in contact with a kli sharis. And again, halacha l'maisa, what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, kitchu b'kli in lo kitchu b'kli lo. Only if something has become consecrated in Kli Sharis is it subject to Lina. But if it's never been in a Kli Sharis, it shouldn't be subject to Lina. So we'll say, see, here our problem is, it sounds like we're leaning towards saying that Ketoras has Kedushas Haguf. Like that's what it sounds like over here, that Ketoras has physical sanctity. The problem is, anything that has physical sanctity is subject to Lina, being left overnight, then it's possible. The problem is something is only subject to lina if it's come in contact with the kli sharis. So Ketoras seems to occupy this very strange space, where on one hand we're suggesting it has physical sanctity, which would make it subject to lina, but it hasn't been in a kli sharis, which means that it's not subject to lina. So how do I reconcile these two things? Amrale says, no, not a problem. Lina kamrit, you worried about lina? Shiny Ketoras, Hoil Vitsurasa Bechol Hashana Kula. So Rabbi say this is fascinating. The Gemara wants to suggest that perhaps Ketoras is not subject to Lina. Right? Why is Ketoras not subject to Lina? Why not? Because it never changes form. So Rabbi say, if you think about it, when does Lina apply? The paradigmatic case of Lina, sacrificial meat. We'll say, what happens if you leave meat out overnight? What happens? It changes, right? It looks different. So the Gemara is suggesting is that perhaps Lina only applies to things which look different if left out. Ketoras, Rabbi say, Ketoras is fantastic, right? You don't need refrigeration, right? I'm assuming you probably need some ideal temperature. Yerushalayim is perfect temperature. Right? So again, but Ketoras, there's no, the Gemara is suggesting maybe Ketoras itself, look at Rashi, Hol v'tzurasa, first white line in Rashi, the appearance of Ketoras never changes by being left overnight. Tilchach afagav v'kedushas hagufhi lo mifsala belina umiu mishikatsha bekli likarev gazer barabanam psulina dilma asi lach shure b'shar miskatsha bekli. So this is fascinating. Here's what the Gemara is suggesting. So just understand. The Gemara is suggesting over here that perhaps where we're holding right now is that Ketoras does have kedushas haguf, does have physical sanctity. Why is it not subject to Lina? It's not subject to Lina because it doesn't change appearance when being left overnight. But, what's the but? Once Ketoras has been put in a Kli Sharis, it is subject to Lina. Right? It is subject to Lina, because that's what we just saw before. Anything that comes into a Kli Sharis is subject to Lina. Why is Ketoras subject to Lina in a Kli Sharis? Why? Because we're afraid that if we don't make it subject to Lina, you'll confuse it with other things that have gone into a Kli Sharis. You'll say, just like Ketoras is not subject to Lina, so too other items that have gone into a Kli Sharis are not subject to Lina as well. Therefore, just in order to create a uniform halacha, we say anything that goes into a Kli Sharis is subject to Lina. But fascinatingly enough, Ketoras, before it goes into a Kli Sharis, even though, again, it has Kedushas Haguf, is not subject to Lina. Why? Because its appearance does not change when being left overnight. Beautiful. Good. So the Gemara says, Miko Mokom, Kasha. So also I say now that we've done that beautiful and magnificently riveting exercise, now the Gemara says, okay, now we're back to square one. Now we'll say, what was square one? Miko Mokom, Kasha, V'chi Kedusha Shebahen Lehecha Halcha. The both say, remember again, let's go back to Rabbi Yochanan. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? It's the first of Nisan. I have leftover sheep in my lishkas hatziloim. They were bought with last year's machzas shekel. I can't offer them this year because they were bought with last year's half shekel. So what do I do with them? What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Redeem it. What do? Go ahead and take money, right? Transfer the sanctity of the sheep onto the money. What do I do with the money? Put it in last year's half shekel pot, What's done with all of the leftover last year's machzis shekel? Use it for temple upkeep, specifically, again, the upkeep of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And then what do I do? Now, again, I have regular sheep, right? Just regular sheep, right? Chulin sheep. What do? Repurchase them with this year's machzis shekel. A beautiful, simple approach. What was the overarching question? How do you do that? Where did their kedusha go? They have kedushas haguf. They have physical sanctity. If they have physical sanctity, so I don't understand, where did that sanctity go? Where did it go that you could just simply redeem it? To which the Gemara says, well, so here it is. Get ready for it. Amar Rabba, well, so here it is. Underline it. Amar Rabba, leiv bezdin masna aleih. Literally, again, I will say, bezdin stipulates regarding the designation of these animals. Let me tell you this outside first, then we'll read it inside. Essentially, the way this Kiddush works is as follows. Beis Din recognizes that when the Beis HaMikdash purchases stuff, so Lamaisa is going to be left over. It's going to be left over. Essentially, what Beis Din says is that the Kedushas Haguf really only devolves upon the stuff that they use. But the stuff that they don't use, the Kedushas Haguf never really, ex post facto, devolves upon it. Now, obviously, again, when all of those sheep are sitting in the Lishkas Atlaim, or all of that Ketores is sitting in the mound of Ketores, we don't know what's going to be used or what's not going to be used. But ex post facto, when you come to first of Nisan and there's 4 leftover sheep or that mound of Ketores, based in stipulated in a way, anything that's not used during the current financial year does not have Kedushas Haguf. Because it does not have Kedushas Haguf, therefore what? It could be easily redeemed. Beautiful. I will say, now let's see it inside. Literally translated, Leiv Beis Din Masna Aleh. So literally again, the heart of Beis Din makes a t'nai, which means Beis Din makes a t'nai, makes a condition about these items. Look at Rashi. Leiv Beis Din, Rashi is 6 lines up from the bottom. Leiv Beis Din Masna Aleh, B'shas Lakicha. At the time that these items are purchased, whether we're talking about kitoras, whether we're talking about sheep. Let's talk about sheep right now. So remember again, this has to do in a general sense, right? That Beis Din, right, the Jewish court, Sanhedrin, Chazal, have control over monetary matters of Klal Yisrael, which is actually quite fascinating, because what it sounds like is we always assumed that was the case for us regular people. Apparently, the concept even of like Hefker, Beis Din, Hefker is apparently over temple finances as well. Beis HaMikdash finances as well. So the way it works is like this. Beis Din says, we understand it's going to be left over. Shabbos says, so again, it's not the pshat that everything has Kedushas Haguf and now we're redeeming it. It's the way Chazal structured is only the stuff you use has Kedushas Haguf. Anything left over never had Kedushas Haguf. Now you'll say, if it never had Kedushas Haguf, then what? Then don't redeem it at all. That far you can't go, because remember again, it was sitting in the Beis HaMikdash. That's going to look very strange if you just take sheep that just lived the last year in the Lishkas Atlaim, and now suddenly again you're making a barbecue, right? That's not going to be right. So you have to undergo some mechanism, ultimately of redemption. But just understand, we thought the whole problem was I'm redeeming something that has physical sanctity without the emergence of a mum or anything else. Kamash Malon, Leiv Beis Din Masa. That's kind of how it works. The way it works is, Beis Din says, only what you use has Kedushas Haguf. What you don't use never had Kedushas Haguf to begin with. Incredible, absolutely incredible. Rashi ends up, Ubechol midi de tzibor, nozdin Beis Din leiv. Any matter concerning the tzibor, Beis Din, it's actually a very heartwarming, a very beautiful phrase. Anything that concerns, Gans Klal Yisrael, Nosten Beis Din leiv. Beis Din puts their heart into that. In other words, Beis Din is concerned regarding all community matters, and therefore halacha l'maisa, again, they said only what you use has Kedushas Haguf, what you don't use does not have Kedushas Haguf. That is wild. Shabbos said, this is Rabbah. So this is Rabbah now reinterpreting Rabbi Yochanan. Incredible. So the Gemara says, and therefore Chazal said, if you need it, you need it. In other words, if you need the sheep, use the sheep. But whatever is left over, you could just simply redeem with money. And you're good to go. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. If that's the case, Amar le Abaye, V'hamarhu da'amar, hikdish zachar ledamav, kadosh kedushas haguf. But Abai says, Rabbi, here's the problem: that you're the one who said that there's really no such thing as being makdish an animal for financial sanctity. Even you said that halacha l'maisa. Rashi's example is if you're makdish an ayol, right? If you take a ram and you say, I hereby am makdish this ram for its financial sanctity, the animal essentially automatically acquires kedushas haguf. That whenever you consecrate an animal consecration always results in kedushas haguf. So I don't understand. Once these sheep are designated, how do you avoid them being vested with kedushas haguf? Lokashya hada amar lidmei ola, hada amar lidmei nesachim. Everything is in how you phrase it. So I will say, so ultimately, again, everything is, now actually this Rashi, by the way, is on Amud Beis. If you just turn to Amud Beis for just a moment, you'll see that top Rashi, it goes on Amud Aleph. Had Amar L'Dmei Ola, Ki Amri Ana Kadosh Kedusha Saguf, Heichad Amri Yehela Havi B'Dam of Ola. So Rabbi says, yeah, when you designate an animal and you say that this animal should be for an Ola, which is what the ayah, which the animal is fit for, that animal is automatically vested with Kedusha Saguf. But Allah L'Maisef, let's say you say this animal should be for Nesachim. Now, both say Nesachim is a wine libation. So what does that mean? That means you're vesting the animal with financial sanctity and not with physical sanctity. So halacha l'maisa, you can see that you could designate, in other words, on a personal level, if you wanted to designate an animal with financial sanctity and not with physical sanctity, you'd have to designate it for something other than a carbonic purpose, like nesachim. I mean, nesachim is a carbon, but it's from wine. But again, here, leiv bezdin masna alehem, and essentially Bezdin structures it once again. What you're going to use has physical sanctity, but what you're not going to use only has financial sanctity. Incredible. Back to Amud Aleph. So Abai raises a kasha. So a par v'sar shom kippurim sha'avdu says great cases. These cases are just incredible. So listen to this. You have your par v'sar shom kippurim. This is a great case, right? So remember, these are your karbanos for Yom Kippur. Your karbanos for Yom Kippur. So a par and sar Yom Kippur sha'avdu. They got lost. They lost. Can you imagine somebody is losing their job, right? Someone is losing, someone's getting fired, right? So they lost the karbanos of Yom Kippur. Okay, but no problem. V'hefresh achirim tachtehem, right? Find another. By the way, in all seriousness, can you imagine that moment in the Beis HaMikdash, right? It's Yom Kippur. Like, okay, hey, Yankel, can you do me a favor? Can you get the par and sa'ir, right? And that moment when they realize that they lost it, right? Can you imagine that? I will say, there's such a tremendous Moshe Haskell. What happens after that moment? There's probably like a pachad. What does it mean? What do we do? What's the message Baruch who's telling us? And then what do they do afterwards? Then what do they do? Right? V'hifresh achirim tachtehem. You just get a replacement. I will say, in life, there are often problems that present themselves that seem tremendously overwhelming and scary. And it's easy to get paralyzed by the challenges of life. What do you do when faced with a challenge in life? Create and orchestrate and choreograph a solution. Don't get paralyzed by the problem. Be solution-oriented in your life approach. So here, they lost the karbanos of Yom Kippur. To me, I don't know, it's traumatic reading it. Right? It's Yom Kippur, you lost the karbanos. Okay, there's a problem, find the solution. Then what happens? So they go ahead and they separate out new karbanos. Fine, no problem. Amud Beis, v'chein si'irei avodah zara. Sha'avdu, right? Similarly, again, you have Seir Avodah Zara, right? Which were, again, a Seir that was, these are the karbanos that are, Rashi says over here, Sibor Shechatu Ba'avodah Zara Ba'araz Bezdin, Meviyim Parli, all of Israel Lechata. So we'll say, this is about the karbanos if Klal Yisrael, through the instruction of Bezdin, accidentally worshipped Avodah Zara. Okay, so what happens? Same thing. They had these karbanos designated, and then it was lost. And what happens? And halacha l'maisa, they went ahead and they separated out new karbanos. Now the part that's not written over here, what happens? Then they find the old ones. So after Yom Kippur, they find the lost parvis sar. After they offer up the carbon for Avodah Zara, they find the one that was lost. So what do you do with these found animals? What do you do with them? So the Gemara says, Kulan yamus te Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, you have to let them die. The lost animals that were now found, you let them die. Rashi says over here, Kulam yamusu, Telo damu l'sirei haragal, Nisam b'hem b'masnisin, Lo karva b'regal zeh, Yikrivu b'regal acher, Aval elu einan ru'uyin ad Yom Kippurim l'shana haba, Ukvar avra lo shana, V'havila mitruma yishana, V'ilchach yamusu gidin chata. So we'll say, so Rabbi Yehuda says, essentially it's nothing to do with these karbanos, because you can't leave them till next Yom Kippur, because if you leave it till next Yom Kippur, they've already aged out, right? Because the sacrifices for Yom Kippur have to be under a year old. So there's nothing to do with them. Same thing for Avodah Zarah. The carbon has already been used. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to just let the animals die. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Omer, no. Yiru achi stavo, no. Let them graze until they develop a mum. V'yimkaru, sell them. V'yiplu d'meim l'nedava. And ultimately, again, use the money. In other words, let them develop a mum because they have kedusha saguf. Let them develop a mum, sell it off, and then use the money for karbani purposes to purchase the dava. The Gemara says, why? She'ein chatas tzibur mesa. Rashi says over here, because halacha l'maisa, again, the only time we allow a carbon just to die is by individual sacrifices. But by carbon tzibur, we don't do that. So again, but the Gemara says, well, 1 second, there's a much easier answer to this. What's the much easier answer? V'amai, lema leiv bezdin masna alehen. They both say, this is like we struck gold. Once you get to this leiv bezdin masna alehen, they both say, that's like the answer for everything. Right? What does that mean? What is leiv bezdin masna? That bezdin says, only the animals you use have the full sanctity. So why don't they say like this? It's true. I separated out the par and the sar for Yom Kippur, but now they got lost. I offered up other animals in their stead. So when I find those animals, what should be the status of those animals? Essentially, I mean, not full chulin, but let me do that. Let me pull a Rabbi Yochanan. Go ahead and just redeem them onto money, right? Let the money be sanctified. Let those animals be chulin. We're good to go. We're good to go. Or repurchase them for something else we want to use. Because late Rose says, essentially what late Beis and Mazlan says Chazal control sacrificial designation. And what they say essentially is that Kedushas Haguf only devolves upon the karbonos you're going to use. But if you're not using the animal for sacrificial purposes, then what? Then it should not really have any sanctity. To which the Gemara says, Avudin ka'amrit? No, don't bring up this case. You're bringing up the case of the animal being lost. This is different. Shiny avudin delo shchichi. The case of lost karbanos is actually not a good case. Why? Because it's not common, which first of all is very good to hear, right? This is not a common occurrence. So because it's not a common occurrence, we'll say in general you see this, that Chazal only legislated in common occurrences. Uncommon occurrences, they choose not to legislate. So because a lost carbon is such a rare occurrence, therefore we don't get into this whole Leiv Bezdin thing. We don't get into that. Instead, again, either we go ahead, according to Rabbi Yehuda, let it die. According to Rabbi Shimon, let it graze until it develops a moment, and then redeem it, let the money go to Nidava. Okay, so that's the Gemara's answer. So this is actually very interesting. So now what you begin to see is that this concept of leiv bezdin masna alein is only applied to normative cases. But what we'll call to exception cases, it's not applied. The Gemara says, really? Hare para de lo shchicha. What about paraduma? This is great. Literally everybody's coming to the party today, right? We've got Yom Kippur, we've got Paraduma, we've got Kitoras, we've got Shlish Kaslan, everything. So what about Paraduma? Paraduma is considered to be an uncommon scenario. Now, we'll say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop over here for today. We'll say, now again, as I told you from the beginning, we're going slow and steady. Because these Gemaras, I feel a little bit guilty for going away last week because I feel that Shevuos got a bad rap. I don't know what happened. I was just gone for a couple of days, but I'm hearing a lot of Shevuos talk. Let's say Shevuos is look at this Gemara. You can't get better Gemara than this. The whole chap is you got to take it slow and steady. So again, we're not behind. We're perfect. At some point in time, over the next couple of weeks, there'll be a short Amud Beis somewhere where we'll make up ground. I would say, supposed to be back with all of you. Shkayach, everyone. All right, have a great day, everyone.